Sometimes the moment someone starts caring about you is the exact moment they start creating distance. They text you less, they become harder to read. They seem interested one day, distant the next, and just when you think something real might be developing, they pull back. You start wondering what changed. Did you say something wrong? Did you become too available? Did they lose interest? Or was the connection never as meaningful to them as it felt to you? But there's a strange possibility most people don't consider. Sometimes people don't pull away because they care less. Sometimes, they pull away because they care more than they know how to handle. And once you understand what can happen inside a person when emotional closeness starts feeling real, a lot of confusing behavior begins to make sense. Because caring about someone sounds simple from the outside, but psychologically caring means becoming vulnerable, and vulnerability changes the rules. When someone doesn't care very much, they have very little to lose. They can talk freely. They can flirt without thinking too much. They can walk away without replaying every conversation in their head. But when feelings become real, something changes. Suddenly, your opinion matters, your silence matters, your reaction matters. The possibility of losing you matters, and for some people that doesn't create closeness. It creates fear. Imagine someone who has spent years learning how to protect themselves emotionally. Maybe they were hurt before. Maybe they grew up in an environment where emotions weren't openly discussed. Maybe they learned that depending on people was dangerous. Maybe every time they trusted someone they eventually felt disappointed, so they developed a strategy: don't get too attached, don't expect too much, don't need anyone too much, stay in control. And for a while, that strategy works. They can have relationships without feeling completely exposed. They can enjoy someone without letting that person become too important. They can leave before they have the chance to be left, but then they meet someone different, someone they actually care about. And suddenly, the emotional distance that once protected them starts becoming difficult to maintain, because now there is something at stake. This is where the contradiction begins. The closer they feel to you, the more vulnerable they feel, and the more vulnerable they feel, the stronger their instinct may become to create distance, not because the connection means nothing, but because it means something. That's the part people often misunderstand. We tend to interpret behavior literally. Someone pulls away, so we assume they don't want us. Someone takes longer to reply, so we assume they've lost interest. Someone becomes emotionally quieter, so we assume they stopped caring. Sometimes that's true. But human behavior is rarely that simple. The same behavior can come from completely different emotional causes. Distance can mean disinterest, but it can also mean uncertainty, fear, overwhelm, self-protection, confusion, or the uncomfortable realization that someone has become important. And when someone becomes important, they gain the ability to hurt you. That's what makes caring so powerful. You can't deeply care about someone without giving them some emotional influence over you. Their words can affect your mood. Their approval can feel meaningful. Their rejection can hurt. Their absence can become noticeable. And for someone who values emotional control above almost everything else, that can feel dangerous. Think about the difference between liking someone and needing to know what they think about you. When you casually like someone, you don't spend hours analyzing a message. You don't wonder why their tone changed. You don't replay the conversation you had 3 days ago. You don't worry about whether you said too much. But once emotional investment grows, your mind becomes more alert. You start noticing things you wouldn't have noticed before: a shorter reply, a delayed message, a different expression, a slight change in tone. And sometimes the person isn't even consciously deciding to do this. Their nervous system is simply reacting to uncertainty. The closer the relationship becomes, the more their mind starts asking questions. What if this doesn't work? What if I get attached and they leave? What if they don't feel the same way? What if I become dependent? What if I lose control? What if they see the parts of me I've been hiding? And there's another question underneath all of those. What if I actually need this person? For some people, that question is terrifying. Because needing someone can feel like weakness when you've spent your life believing that strength means never needing anyone. So instead of moving closer, they move back, not always consciously. Sometimes they create distance through small behaviors. They stop initiating conversations. They become unusually busy. They take longer to respond. They become less emotionally expressive. They suddenly need space. They may even start acting as though they don't care as much as they clearly did before. And from the outside, it can look irrational. Why would someone walk away from something they seem to genuinely want? Because emotional desire and emotional safety are not always the same thing. Someone can deeply want closeness, and simultaneously be afraid of it. That's one of the most important things to understand about human relationships. Wanting something doesn't automatically mean you're emotionally prepared to receive it. A person can want love and still fear intimacy. They can want connection and still avoid vulnerability. They can miss you and still refuse to reach out. They can care about you and still create distance. And this is where we have to be careful. Understanding someone's fear does not mean excusing unhealthy behavior. It doesn't mean you should chase them. It doesn't mean every person who pulls away secretly loves you. And it definitely doesn't mean you should spend months decoding someone's silence while ignoring what their actions are telling you. Sometimes distance really is rejection. Sometimes people genuinely lose interest. Sometimes they simply don't want the relationship. The deeper point is that you cannot know the reason just by looking at the distance itself. You have to look at the pattern, and you have to look at what happens underneath it, because there is a major difference between someone who is emotionally overwhelmed and someone who is emotionally unavailable. Someone who is overwhelmed may eventually communicate. They may recognize their behavior. They may come back and explain. They may try to repair the distance. Someone who is consistently unavailable may keep repeating the same cycle without taking responsibility for it. Closeness, distance, hope. Confusion, silence, and then closeness again. That cycle can become emotionally exhausting, especially when you start believing that if you just become more understanding, more patient, more loving, you can finally make the person feel safe enough to stay. But relationships don't work that way. You cannot love someone into emotional readiness. You can create safety. You can communicate clearly. You can be patient. But the other person still has to choose vulnerability for themselves. And sometimes the reason people pull away has less to do with you than with what being close to you forces them to confront about themselves. Because intimacy is revealing. When someone gets close enough, they don't just see your strengths. They begin to see your insecurities, your habits, your fears, your contradictions. The parts of you that you carefully manage around everyone else. And being truly seen can be frightening. A person may be comfortable being admired, but uncomfortable being known. There's a difference. Being admired allows you to control the image. Being known means someone starts seeing behind it. Imagine someone who has always appeared confident. They're funny, independent, successful, emotionally composed. They don't need much from anyone. Then they meet someone who makes them feel safe enough to lower their guard. For the first time, they talk about things they normally keep private. They admit fears. They reveal insecurities. They become emotionally dependent in small ways. And then one day, they realize what happened. Someone now knows them, really knows them, and that realization can trigger fear, because now rejection wouldn't just mean someone didn't like me. It could feel like someone saw the real me and still decided I wasn't enough. That's a much deeper wound, so they may pull away before they have to discover the answer. They leave before they can be rejected. They become distant before the other person can become powerful enough to hurt them. This is one reason self-protection can look like indifference. The person isn't necessarily saying, I don't care. Their behavior may be saying, I care. And I don't know how to feel safe caring this much. And there's another psychological pattern that can make this even more complicated. People often feel comfortable with what is familiar, even when what is familiar isn't healthy. If someone has learned that closeness eventually leads to disappointment, then emotional distance may feel normal. Healthy intimacy can actually feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels threatening. A person can meet someone kind, consistent, patient, and emotionally available, and somehow feel less comfortable than they did with someone unpredictable. That doesn't necessarily mean they prefer being mistreated. It may simply mean their emotional system learned to associate uncertainty with excitement and stability with vulnerability. So when someone finally offers them consistency, they don't always relax. Sometimes they become suspicious. Why are you being so kind? What do you want? Why are you so interested? How long is this going to last? And eventually, they may create a problem where there wasn't one. They may search for flaws. They may suddenly question the relationship. They may convince themselves they're losing feelings. Not because the other person became less attractive, but because emotional safety removed the distraction of uncertainty. Now they have to confront the actual relationship. And that can be uncomfortable. There's something else that happens when people start caring. Their imagination becomes involved. Before feelings become serious, you're responding to what is actually happening. After feelings become serious, you start responding to what might happen. What if this becomes something real? What if we get closer? What if I fall in love? What if they leave? What if I ruin it? What if I lose myself? The future enters the room, and sometimes the future is more frightening than the present. A person might be perfectly happy talking to you tonight, but once they imagine where the connection could lead, their anxiety starts building. So they create distance to bring themselves back into emotional control. That's why someone can seem completely warm one day and strangely cold the next. The warmth came from connection. The distance came from regulation. They moved toward you until their emotions became too intense. Then they moved away until they felt safe again. Then they missed the connection, so they came back. Then the closeness became intense again, and the cycle repeated. This is sometimes called a push-pull dynamic, and it can happen in many forms. One person pursues, the other withdraws. The first person senses the withdrawal and becomes more anxious. They send another message. They ask what's wrong. They try harder. The other person feels even more pressure and pulls away further. Now both people are reacting to each other's reactions, and neither person feels understood. The person pursuing thinks, why don't they care? The person withdrawing thinks, why won't they give me space? And the more each person acts from fear, the more the other person feels threatened. This is how a connection that once felt natural can become emotionally complicated. But here's where something important happens. If you are the person being left behind in this dynamic, you may start taking responsibility for the entire emotional situation. You begin analyzing every action. Maybe I texted too much. Maybe I didn't text enough. Maybe I showed too much interest. Maybe I should have acted more distant. Maybe I should have been harder to get. Maybe I should have said something differently. And suddenly, instead of experiencing a relationship, you're managing a psychological puzzle. That's exhausting, and it can slowly change how you see yourself. You start believing that being loved requires perfect behavior, that if you say the wrong thing, you'll be abandoned, that if you care too openly, you'll lose your value. That if someone pulls away, you need to become more mysterious. But real connection shouldn't require you to constantly perform emotional gymnastics. You should not have to pretend you care less than you do just to keep someone interested. You shouldn't have to manufacture uncertainty to create attraction. And you shouldn't have to shrink your emotional needs to make someone comfortable. There's a difference between giving someone space and abandoning yourself while waiting for them. That's a line worth remembering, because sometimes people pull away when they start caring, and sometimes we pull away from ourselves when we start caring about them. We stop asking, is this relationship good for me? And start asking only, how do I get them back? Those are very different questions. The first one protects your dignity. The second one can make you lose it. And this is where the deeper truth begins. The goal isn't to figure out whether someone secretly cares. The goal is to understand whether they are capable of building something healthy with that care. Because feelings alone aren't enough. Someone can care deeply about you and still be incapable of treating you well. Someone can be afraid of losing you and still repeatedly hurt you. Someone can miss you and still not be ready for a relationship. Someone can love you and still be emotionally unavailable. That's painful, but it's important. Because sometimes we romanticize someone's internal struggle. We imagine that their distance is evidence of deep feelings. We turn inconsistency into mystery. We turn avoidance into vulnerability. We turn silence into hidden love. And sometimes, we're simply making excuses for behavior that hurts us. A healthier perspective is more balanced. Maybe they care, maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're confused, maybe they have emotional patterns they haven't worked through, but regardless of the reason, what matters is what they consistently do. Behavior doesn't tell you everything about someone's feelings, but it tells you a lot about their capacity, and capacity matters. Imagine someone standing outside a door, they want to come inside. They can see the warmth, they can see the people they care about, they may even wish they could enter. But they can't bring themselves to open the door. Does it matter that they want to come inside? Of course, but if you're already inside, you still cannot live your life standing at the door waiting for them. That's the difficult part of emotional maturity. You can understand someone without waiting indefinitely for them. You can have compassion without abandoning your boundaries. You can recognize someone's fear without making their fear your responsibility. And you can care about someone without chasing them every time they run. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to force closeness. Give the person room to reveal what they actually want, not through promises, through behavior. If they need space, let them have space. If they care, allow them the opportunity to show it. If they come back, look at what changed, not just what they say, what changed. Did they become more honest? More consistent, more communicative, more willing to tolerate vulnerability, or did they simply miss your attention? Those are not the same thing. Because sometimes people don't miss the relationship. They miss the emotional comfort they received from you, they miss being wanted, they miss having someone available. They miss knowing that someone cared, and when that comfort disappears, they return. But returning isn't the same as changing, that's an important distinction. You don't need to punish someone for pulling away, you don't need to become cold, you don't need to play games, you don't need to disappear just to make them chase you. You simply need to stop doing the emotional work for two people, let their actions speak. And while you're doing that, look at your own emotional reaction. Because if someone's distance immediately makes you panic, there may be something happening inside you too. Maybe you learn to interpret distance as abandonment. Maybe uncertainty makes you feel unsafe. Maybe you become more attached when someone becomes less available. Maybe their withdrawal activates a fear of not being enough. And this is where the psychology becomes even more interesting. Sometimes two people can trigger each other's deepest emotional patterns without either person intending to. One person fears abandonment, the other fears closeness. The more one person pursues, the more the other withdraws, the more the other withdraws, the more the first person pursues. Neither person wakes up thinking, today I'm going to make this relationship emotionally exhausting. They're simply protecting themselves in opposite ways. One moves toward connection to feel safe. The other moves away from connection to feel safe. And both believe they're responding rationally. That's why emotional maturity isn't just about understanding other people. It's about noticing your own patterns too. When someone pulls away, what happens inside you? Do you immediately chase? Do you become angry? Do you pretend not to care? Do you obsessively analyze their behavior? Do you withdraw first so you can't be rejected? Do you start trying to prove your value? Those reactions tell you something. Not that something is wrong with you, but that something inside you has been activated, and that awareness gives you a choice. Instead of reacting immediately, you can pause. You can ask yourself, what do I actually know? Not what you fear, not what you hope, not what you've imagined. What do you actually know? You know they became distant, that's a fact. You don't necessarily know why, and that difference is incredibly important because the mind hates uncertainty. When information is missing, it tries to fill the gap. And it often fills the gap with the story that hurts the most. They don't care, they're leaving, I wasn't enough, someone else is better, I ruined everything. But the truth might be completely different. Maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they're scared, maybe they're dealing with something unrelated to you, maybe they need time, maybe they lost interest. You don't know until their behavior or communication gives you more information. And sometimes, not knowing is something you have to tolerate. Emotional strength isn't always having the answer. Sometimes it's being able to sit with uncertainty without destroying yourself with assumptions. That's a very different kind of confidence. It's not the confidence of knowing someone will stay. It's the confidence of knowing you'll be okay even if they don't. And that changes everything. Because once you stop believing that another person's attention determines your worth, their distance becomes information rather than a verdict. You can notice it without collapsing under it. You can care without chasing. You can hope without obsessing. You can love without losing yourself, and ironically, that is often what healthy closeness requires, not less caring, more emotional stability. Because the healthiest relationships aren't built by two people who never feel afraid. They're built by two people who can feel fear without allowing fear to control every decision. Someone can say, I'm scared, I'm overwhelmed, I don't know what I'm feeling, I need some time. And those words create a bridge, silence creates a wall, that's why communication matters so much. Not perfect communication, human communication, the willingness to say what is happening instead of forcing the other person to guess. Because when someone pulls away without explanation, the person left behind is forced into interpretation. And interpretation is where anxiety grows. One person knows what's happening inside themselves. The other person doesn't, so the other person starts searching for clues, and the more clues they search for, the more emotionally invested they become in every tiny detail. A message sent at 10:03 suddenly means something. A message sent at 10:17 means something else. A missed call becomes evidence. A social media post becomes evidence. A change in tone becomes evidence. And eventually, you aren't relating to the person anymore, you're relating to your interpretation of them. That's when connection becomes obsession. And you deserve better than that. You deserve relationships where curiosity doesn't have to replace communication, where closeness doesn't have to be earned through anxiety, where you don't have to constantly wonder whether someone wants you. Because the deepest form of attraction isn't confusion. It's emotional safety. And emotional safety doesn't mean everything is predictable. It means you can be honest without constantly fearing punishment. You can express interest without feeling ashamed. You can ask for reassurance without feeling weak. You can have boundaries without fearing abandonment. And you can give someone space without wondering whether the relationship has disappeared forever. That's what makes mature connection different. There is room for uncertainty. But there is also enough consistency to survive it. So if someone has recently pulled away from you after becoming close, don't immediately assume you did something wrong. And don't immediately assume they're secretly in love with you either. Pause, look at the whole pattern. What was the relationship like before the distance? Were they becoming more vulnerable? Did they open up and then suddenly retreat? Have they shown signs of fear around emotional closeness? Do they eventually communicate? Do they take responsibility? Are they trying to build something with you? Or are you doing all the emotional work? Those questions are more useful than trying to decode a single unanswered message. And if you are the person who tends to pull away when you start caring, then maybe the question is slightly different. What are you protecting yourself from? Rejection, dependence, loss of control? Being seen, being disappointed, because sometimes the person you're running from isn't the other person. It's the version of yourself that appears when you allow yourself to care, the softer version. The uncertain version, the version that needs reassurance, the version that doesn't know what happens next, the version that can't guarantee the relationship will last. And maybe that's what scares you, because caring means accepting that you cannot control the outcome. You can choose someone, you can communicate, you can be loyal, you can be honest. But you cannot guarantee that they will stay, and no amount of emotional distance can give you that guarantee either. That's the uncomfortable truth about intimacy. You can protect yourself from pain, but you also protect yourself from depth. You can avoid rejection, but you also avoid being fully known. You can refuse to need anyone. But you may also miss the experience of being deeply connected to someone. At some point, emotional maturity becomes less about eliminating vulnerability and more about learning that vulnerability is survivable. You can care, you can be hurt, you can lose someone and still remain yourself. That's the freedom people often discover much later than they should. You don't need to become emotionally invulnerable. You need to become emotionally resilient. There's a difference. Being invulnerable says, nothing can hurt me. Resilience says, something might hurt me, but I trust myself to handle it. And when you develop that kind of trust in yourself, you stop needing other people to behave perfectly for you to feel safe. You can accept their humanity without accepting mistreatment. You can understand their fear without becoming trapped inside it. You can give them space without chasing, and if they choose to return, you can decide whether their return actually fits into your life. That's a much stronger position than waiting helplessly for someone to make a decision about your worth. Because their distance doesn't determine your value. Their fear doesn't determine your value. Their inability to communicate doesn't determine your value, and their decision to stay or leave doesn't change the person you were before they arrived. Sometimes people pull away when they start caring because caring forces them to face the possibility of loss. Sometimes they pull away because closeness exposes wounds they haven't learned how to handle. Sometimes they pull away because they simply don't want the relationship. And sometimes, you may never know which one it was, but you don't need to know every hidden reason to know what you deserve. You deserve clarity, you deserve consistency, you deserve mutual effort. You deserve a connection where caring doesn't feel like a punishment, and if someone needs to step back, let them. Not as a game, not as manipulation, not because you want them to chase you, but because you understand something important now. You cannot force someone to feel safe enough to love you. You cannot argue someone into vulnerability. You cannot chase someone into emotional readiness. All you can do is be honest about what you feel, honest about what you need, and honest about what their behavior is showing you. Then you let the truth reveal itself, because sometimes, the person who pulls away comes back with greater clarity. Sometimes they realize what they were afraid of and choose to face it. And sometimes they don't. Both outcomes can hurt, but only one requires you to abandon yourself, and you don't have to do that. Maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside this strange human behavior. When someone pulls away after becoming close, the most important question isn't always, why are they running from me? Sometimes the better question is, why am I running after someone who is running away? That question changes the entire dynamic. It brings your attention back to where it belongs, not on controlling their emotions, not on decoding their silence, not on proving your worth, but on understanding your own. Because healthy love isn't about finding someone who never gets scared. It's about finding and becoming someone who can communicate when they do, someone who can say, "This matters to me and that's why I'm afraid." Instead of disappearing, someone who can say, "I need a little space but I don't want to lose this." Instead of creating confusion, someone who can say, "I'm not ready." Instead of keeping another person emotionally waiting. And maybe that's what real emotional courage looks like, not being fearless, but caring enough to be honest even when honesty feels dangerous. So if someone pulls away when they start caring, don't automatically chase them, don't automatically blame yourself, don't automatically romanticize their distance. Pause, observe, let their actions unfold, and remember. Sometimes distance is a sign of fear, sometimes it's a sign of confusion, sometimes it's a sign of self-protection, and sometimes it's simply a sign that the person isn't able or willing to give you what you need. You don't have to turn every mystery into a love story. You don't have to turn every silence into rejection either. You can simply allow reality to be reality. And if this made you look at human behavior a little differently, keep exploring these deeper conversations with us here at NEXMIND Core. Because the more you understand people, the more importantly you begin to understand yourself. And perhaps the most peaceful realization is this. You don't need someone to stop pulling away before you can feel secure. You need to know that if they step closer, you'll welcome them. And if they step away, you won't abandon yourself to follow. Because the right connection doesn't require you to chase someone into staying. It doesn't require you to become smaller. It doesn't require you to pretend you care less. It simply creates enough safety for two people to stand there, honest about what they feel, honest about what they fear, and brave enough to stay present when caring becomes real. And sometimes, that's the moment everything changes, not when someone finally stops being afraid, but when they realize they don't have to run from what they feel, and neither do you.